If your mind has never truly let you rest, if even your stillest days carry a current of unease beneath the surface, then what you are about to hear may be the clearest reflection of something you have been quietly carrying for a very long time. In today's audiobook, we explore the desire to do nothing, the exhausted, aching, sometimes shameful wish to simply stop, and what that desire is truly trying to reveal about your inner world. This is the heart of desire to do nothing all day. Jung reveals what your perfectionist mind is hiding, published by Stillness Audiobooks. In these pages, we go beyond the surface of laziness or burnout, and we invite you to reflect deeply on what this theme truly means in your own life. This is not a manual, it is a mirror. Before we continue, if this kind of exploration speaks to you, if you find yourself returning to audiobooks that help you understand your own mind rather than manage it, we invite you to follow the channel. There is more waiting for you here. Now let us begin. Picture a Sunday morning. The alarm does not ring. There is nothing that must be done. The light comes in through the curtains at an angle that should feel peaceful, golden and slow. And yet something in you cannot fully settle into it. You make the coffee, you sit, and almost immediately a restlessness begins to move beneath the quiet. A thought, I should be doing something. Another thought, I am wasting time. A third, people like me do not rest. We fall behind. This is the experience of millions of people across the modern world, people who have spent years training themselves to produce, to achieve, to perform, and who now find, paradoxically, that rest itself has become a source of anxiety. And so, when the desire to do nothing arrives, when the body and the deep mind conspire to produce that overwhelming wish to simply lie down and let the day pass, it arrives not as ease, but as conflict. On one side, the exhausted self, desperate to stop. On the other, the inner voice that sounds suspiciously like every authority figure who ever told you that your worth must be earned. This audiobook is an exploration of that conflict, and more importantly, of what lies beneath it. Because the desire to do nothing in most people who experience it intensely is not laziness, it is a signal. And signals, in the language of the deep mind, carry meaning. Over the course of these 6 chapters, we will move through the full architecture of this experience. In the first chapter, we explore the origins of perfectionism, not as a character flaw, but as a deeply intelligent adaptation. In the second, we examine the internal machinery of the perfectionist mind, how it thinks, how it evaluates, and why it cannot stop. In the third chapter, we look at the daily life of someone living inside this machinery, the textures of exhaustion, the hidden weight of invisible effort. In the fourth, we uncover the deeper patterns that drive perfectionism far beneath the surface, the fears, the symbols, and the unconscious agreements that most people never examine. In the fifth chapter, we explore the natural movement toward balance, not as a discipline, but as a return. And in the sixth, we consider what a life beyond perfectionist exhaustion might actually look like, not as an ideal, but as a lived possibility. Let us dive into the root of this, chapter by chapter. Chapter 1. The Origin. How the Perfectionist Mind Was Born. There is a particular kind of child who learns very early that love is conditional, not cruel, not absent, conditional. This is an important distinction. The love is real. The warmth is genuine. But somewhere woven into the fabric of ordinary family life, the child absorbs a message, often wordlessly, often through the subtle shift in a parent's expression, the slight cooling of approval when a result disappoints, that being good is not quite enough, that being exceptional is what is truly wanted. Common patterns in human development suggest that this kind of conditional approval does not produce resentment in children, at least not initially. It produces something far more ambitious. It produces a child who works, who tries harder, who discovers in the loop between effort and approval a way of securing the love and safety that every child needs. And because this strategy works, because the exceptional result does produce warmth, praise, relief, the child does not question it. They refine it. By the time this child becomes an adult, the strategy has become invisible. It is no longer experienced as a response to external pressure. It is experienced as personality, as identity, as simply the way I am. The perfectionist does not think, I learned to perform in order to feel safe. They think, I have high standards. I care about quality. I cannot help it. I want things done properly. And none of this is wrong. The care is real, the standards are real. But what is also real, buried beneath the careful architecture of achievement, is the original fear. The fear that without the performance, the approval would vanish. That without the result, the self would be insufficient. Many observe that perfectionism is often described as a strength in cultural narratives, something to be listed on a job application with a slight, knowing smile. And in certain ways, it does produce results. The perfectionist completes things, meets deadlines, often exceeds expectations. They are reliable in the way that only people driven by fear tend to be, not from love of the task, but from the dread of what it would mean to fall short. But here is the crucial insight that this chapter invites us to sit with. The perfectionist mind was not born in ambition. It was born in love. It was a child's most intelligent response to the emotional environment they found themselves in. It developed because it worked. And it persists decades later, not because the original threat still exists, but because the nervous system, once trained to equate performance with safety, does not easily forget. The desire to do nothing, then, begins to make sense in this light. It is not a failure of character. It is the body's cry for what the child never truly received, rest that required nothing, stillness that asked for no return, a moment of simply being without the weight of becoming. This is where perfectionism was born, not in ambition, in love, longing, and the deepest human need to belong. And this is where, if we are willing to look clearly, the path towards something different begins. Chapter 2. The Machinery. How the perfectionist mind actually operates. There is a particular quality to the thinking of a perfectionist that sets it apart from ordinary careful thought. It is not just meticulous, it is recursive. It loops back on itself endlessly, checking, rechecking, evaluating from new angles, anticipating criticism before it arrives, locating the flaw in a plan before the plan has even been fully formed. Many observe that the perfectionist mind does not simply think about a task. It thinks about what others will think about the task, and then it thinks about what it would mean if those others were disappointed, and then it wonders whether even the worrying itself is a sign of some deeper inadequacy. Imagine working on something you genuinely care about, a presentation, a piece of writing, a project you have invested weeks into. You finish a draft, you sit back, and instead of feeling the satisfaction that the effort deserves, you feel a quiet dread. You begin to scan the work for weaknesses. You find 3, you fix them, and in doing so you notice 2 more. The fixing and the finding form a loop, and the loop does not have a natural stopping point. Completion is not a destination. It is a horizon that recedes as you approach it. This is not a failure of intelligence. In fact, the reverse is often true. The perfectionist mind is frequently a highly capable mind, one that has been trained to run its evaluation processes continuously at a level of detail that other minds simply do not engage. The problem is not that it cannot think. The problem is that it cannot stop. Common understanding in psychological observation suggests this is related to what some describe as an overly active inner critic, a part of the psyche that was originally modeled on external authority figures and then internalized so completely that it now operates as though it were the voice of reality itself. This inner critic is not experienced as something separate from the self. It is experienced as clarity, as judgment, as seeing things as they truly are, without flattery or illusion. The perfectionist who tells themselves they are simply being realistic is, in many cases, mistaking the voice of an old fear for the voice of truth. There is another dimension to this machinery that is worth examining carefully: the role of imagined audiences. The perfectionist mind does not operate in private. Even in their most solitary moments, the perfectionist is performing, not for anyone visible, but for an internal committee of evaluators whose standards are impossible to fully satisfy. This committee is assembled from fragments of real people: the exacting teacher, the demanding parent, the competitive colleague, but it is run by something deeper, the original fear of insufficiency. And so the machinery hums, even in the shower, even in the quiet hour before sleep. The evaluation continues, the planning continues, the rehearsal of future scenarios, the rerunning of past ones, the measuring of the self against an ever-shifting standard. All of this continues with a kind of tireless, automatic persistence that the perfectionist has simply come to accept as the price of being who they are. It is worth asking, when does this machine rest? The honest answer for many people caught in this pattern is almost never. It runs at full speed during work. It runs at a quieter hum during leisure. It continues even in sleep, where dreams frequently involve themes of being evaluated, being unprepared, arriving late, or failing in some public and irreversible way. This is the machinery that underlies the desire to do nothing. When the body reaches the limit of what it can sustain, when the nervous system finally signals collapse, the desire to stop is not laziness. It is the system overheating. It is a circuit breaker engaging. The need to do nothing is the mind and body's most urgent attempt to interrupt a process that doesn't know how to interrupt itself. Chapter 3. The Daily Life, Living Inside the Perfectionist Experience. It begins before the alarm, in the grey interval between sleep and waking, before the day has formally begun. Something in the perfectionist mind is already moving. A thought surfaces, often the unfinished item from the night before, then another. A sense of the day assembling itself ahead, with its demands and its deadlines and its ambient possibility of failure. By the time the eyes open, the mind is already several steps ahead of the body, already rehearsing, already preparing. Many observe that the perfectionist experience of mornings is one of the most revealing windows into the pattern, while others may use the first moments of the day for a slow, gradual return to waking life. The perfectionist arrives already dressed in effort. The day does not begin with presence. It begins with assessment. Consider a professional in their mid-30s, someone who is good at their work, recognized by their peers, trusted by their organization. From the outside, they appear composed and capable. Inside, however, the experience of an ordinary working day is something quite different. Every email carries the possibility of having said something imprecise. Every meeting involves a subtle layer of self-monitoring that runs parallel to the ostensible content of the conversation. Am I coming across clearly? Did that land? Did I speak too much? Not enough? Every positive piece of feedback is catalogued briefly and then set aside. Every neutral or ambiguous response is analyzed at length. This disparity between external appearance and internal experience is one of the most consistent features of perfectionist life. The world sees the high performer. The person inside the performance sees only the gap between what was done and what might ideally have been done. Evenings carry their own texture. There is often a ritual of review that takes place, rarely consciously chosen, but reliably present. A mental replay of the day's significant moments, scanning for errors, for missed opportunities, for the things that were said or unsaid that might have consequences not yet visible. This review does not produce resolution. It produces more material for tomorrow's anxiety. And then there is the particular quality of weekend guilt, that low, persistent unease that settles in whenever the perfectionist is not producing. The sense that rest must be earned, that leisure is a luxury that must be justified, that the absence of output is a kind of failure in itself. This is perhaps the most poignant feature of the perfectionist daily life, the inability to be simply present without an agenda. Rest is colored by the awareness of everything that is not being done. The desire to do nothing arises, in this context, not as a preference, but as a collapse. The body goes on strike. The system that has been running on override for weeks or months or years simply refuses to continue. And because the stopping feels involuntary, because it comes not from choice but from exhaustion, the perfectionist frequently cannot rest, even in the resting. They lie on the sofa and feel guilty. They take a walk and feel unproductive. The machine, even in its breakdown, continues to evaluate the quality of the breakdown. This is the daily texture of perfectionist life, and it is important to name it, not in order to diagnose or pathologize it, but to recognize it, fully, clearly, without minimizing, as a way of living that carries a very real and significant cost. Chapter 4. The Hidden Patterns. What lies beneath the surface? Every visible pattern of behavior has a layer beneath it that is less visible and more fundamental. In perfectionism, the visible layer is the drive to do things well, the high standards, the careful attention, the refusal to settle. But beneath that layer, common psychological observation suggests the presence of something older and more primal, a cluster of fears that most perfectionists have never fully examined, and that the drive to achieve is, in large part, designed to keep at bay. The first and most fundamental of these fears is the fear of being truly seen and found wanting. There is a profound difference between wanting to do good work and needing the work to stand in for a self that feels, at some level, insufficient. The perfectionist, who cannot put down a project, often cannot do so because the project has become a proxy for their worth. If the work is good enough, then perhaps, temporarily, provisionally, they are good enough. This is not a thought that most perfectionists would articulate. It operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. But it shapes behavior at every level. The second hidden pattern is the management of shame. Many observe that perfectionism and shame have a deep and rarely examined relationship. Shame, the sense of being fundamentally flawed rather than simply having made a mistake, is an extraordinarily uncomfortable emotional state. The perfectionist mind, often without knowing it, runs on a prevention model. If I can do things well enough, I will not have to feel that shame. The exhausting effort is, in this sense, a kind of emotional prophylaxis. The price paid in effort is experienced as less terrible than the price of exposure. The third hidden pattern is what might be called the tyranny of the ideal. The perfectionist mind is not merely comparing the actual against the good. It is comparing the actual against a mental image of the ideal that is often impossible by definition, because it is constructed by the same imagination that has been trained to anticipate every flaw. The ideal shifts each time the actual approaches it. This is not a feature of the work, it is a feature of the mind doing the evaluating. And beneath all of these patterns, there is a fourth, perhaps the deepest of all. It is the fear of what would happen in the absence of striving. The perfectionist has, in many cases, built an identity so thoroughly around achievement and effort that the prospect of genuine rest feels not just unproductive, but somehow annihilating. If I stop performing, who am I? This is a question that many people carrying this pattern have never allowed themselves to fully ask. Because the asking itself feels dangerous. The doing is safe. The undone self is the unknown, and the unknown is the place where all the fears live. It is from this depth that the desire to do nothing all day draws its particular power. It is not merely tiredness. It is the surfacing of the unlived self, the part of a person that has never been permitted to exist without a purpose. The desire to simply be without producing, without performing, without justifying the occupation of space. This is the voice of something that has been waiting patiently for a very long time. Understanding these hidden patterns does not immediately dissolve them, but naming them clearly, without flinching, without minimizing, is the first movement toward a different relationship with them. What has been invisible exerts its power in the dark. What has been seen can gradually begin to be engaged with honestly. Chapter 5. The Return, the Natural Path Toward Balance. There is a particular misunderstanding that runs through most conventional advice about perfectionism, and it is worth naming at the outset of this chapter, the idea that the solution to perfectionism is simply to try less hard, to lower your standards, to be comfortable with good enough. This misunderstanding is not only unhelpful, it is in many cases deeply counterproductive. Because the perfectionist who is told to lower their standards does not feel liberated. They feel exposed. They feel the original fear moving closer. The movement toward balance is not a movement toward less. It is a movement toward different. And more precisely, it is a movement toward an inner experience of effort that is rooted in something other than fear. Common observation in the psychology of human motivation suggests a clear distinction between what might be called driven effort and engaged effort. Driven effort is effortful by necessity. It is powered by the anxiety of what will happen if the effort is not made. It is exhausting not primarily because of its volume, but because of its quality. Every hour of driven effort is shadowed by the evaluating mind, the inner critic, the anticipation of failure. The effort is never fully completed because the relief never fully arrives. Engaged effort feels qualitatively different. It arises from genuine curiosity, from care, from the pleasure of the thing itself rather than from its anticipated reception. People who work from this orientation are not less productive. Often they are more so over longer periods with less depletion. But the inner experience of the same amount of work is entirely different. The mind is present to the task rather than hovering above it in evaluation. The movement from the first mode to the second is not a matter of decision. It cannot be accomplished by willpower, which is simply more driven effort applied to the problem of driven effort. It is, instead, a gradual process of recognizing and relating differently to the inner critic, not silencing it, but understanding it, not defeating it, but tracing it back to its origin and recognizing it for what it is. Not the voice of truth, but the voice of an old, frightened child who learned that performance was the price of love. This recognition, when it genuinely occurs, tends to produce something unexpected: compassion. Not the self-congratulatory kind that the perfectionist mind tends to distrust, but a quiet, sober compassion for the difficulty of having lived inside this pattern for so long. And it is from this compassion that a different relationship with rest becomes possible. Rest, in the perfectionist's experience, has been colored by guilt and inadequacy. But genuine rest, rest that is not merely the absence of effort, but the active presence of ease, is not possible while the evaluating mind is still running. What the desire to do nothing is pointing toward is not laziness. It is the body's intuitive understanding that somewhere beneath all the performance, there is a self that simply needs to be allowed to exist. The natural path toward balance, then, does not involve dismantling the care or the standards or the capacity for effort. It involves returning slowly and with patience to a relationship with the self that does not depend on production for its worth. It involves learning, perhaps for the first time in the adult life, what it feels like to rest without apology. This is not quick. It is not linear. There will be long periods in which the old machinery reasserts itself with complete confidence, but the direction once understood does not change, and the desire to do nothing, once it has been seen for what it truly is, becomes not a symptom to be managed, but a compass pointing towards something that has been waiting to be found. Chapter 6. The Transformed Life. What becomes possible on the other side. There is a version of this story that ends with the perfectionist simply becoming less anxious, less driven, more willing to accept imperfection. And while this is, in a sense, accurate, it is also significantly incomplete. Because what common observation suggests about people who genuinely work through this pattern, who trace it back to its roots, who begin to relate to the inner critic with understanding rather than compliance, is that what changes is not merely the level of anxiety. What changes is the entire texture of the inner life. Imagine a person who has spent 20 years building their sense of worth entirely on the foundation of what they produce. Every project completed, every deadline met, every compliment received has been laid into the structure as a kind of temporary scaffolding. The structure stands, and it is impressive. But it must be continually reinforced because its foundation is not stable. It is built on the shifting ground of external evaluation. Now imagine that same person, over time and with genuine inner work, beginning to locate a different kind of ground. Not the ground of achievement, which is real and remains available, but a ground that exists prior to achievement. The simple, unearned fact of being a person, of occupying a life, of having a consciousness that notices and feels and wonders quite apart from anything that it produces. This shift, and it is a genuine shift, not merely a change in belief, tends to produce changes that radiate outward in unexpected directions. The quality of relationships often changes first. The perfectionist who has been relating to others partly through the lens of performance, managing their impression, anticipating judgment, calibrating their self-disclosure, begins, almost tentatively at first, to allow others to see them more fully, and they discover, often with some surprise, that being seen does not produce the disaster they had anticipated, that people are capable of holding the imperfect self with warmth. Work changes too, though not in the way one might expect. Many observe that as the terror of failure recedes, a different quality of engagement with work becomes possible, one marked not by anxious precision, but by genuine curiosity. The work that was once a performance becomes an exploration. The standard that was once a weapon becomes a value. The difference is subtle but profound, the same high-quality output produced from an entirely different inner state. And then there is rest. Perhaps the most significant transformation for the person who has lived inside perfectionist exhaustion is the discovery of what genuine rest actually feels like. Not the guilty half-rest of the overloaded weekend, not the collapse of complete depletion, but the easeful, full-bodied rest of a person who has given themselves permission, real permission, not merely its intellectual approximation, to simply be. The desire to do nothing all day, which began as a signal of distress, becomes, in the transformed life, something closer to a natural rhythm. The movement between effort and rest, between engagement and withdrawal, between the self that produces and the self that simply exists, this movement becomes available, not as a problem to be solved, but as a feature of being human that can, at last, be inhabited honestly. Common observation in the longer arc of people's lives suggests that this transformation does not arrive as a dramatic event. It arrives as a series of small recognitions, each one loosening something that had been held too tightly for too long. A moment of genuine laughter that does not immediately produce a performance assessment. An evening in which the review does not take place. A morning in which the alarm sounds and the first feeling is something close to readiness rather than dread. These small moments are not trivial. They are the evidence of a life rearranging itself around something more durable than performance. They are the accumulated return of something that was never in truth lost, only buried under the weight of a story that said the self must be earned. We are approaching the end of this audiobook, and before we arrive there, a reflection feels fitting. Stillness. Audiobooks exists to explore exactly this kind of territory, the deep interior landscapes of human psychology that rarely make it into the conversations we have in ordinary life. If this audiobook has felt like recognition, if something in these pages has named an experience you have been living but not fully articulating, then there are many more explorations waiting for you. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and let the next audiobook find you when you are ready. Throughout these chapters, we have seen that the desire to do nothing is rarely what it appears to be on the surface. It is not failure. It is not weakness. It is not a character defect that must be overcome by renewed effort or stricter self-discipline. It is, at its deepest level, a signal from the most intelligent part of a human being, the part that has been running on an old inherited program for so long that it has begun to forget that programs can be examined, changed, outgrown. We have traced the origin of perfectionism back to its roots in the earliest relational experiences, the conditional approval, the learned equation between performance and belonging. We have examined the machinery by which this pattern sustains itself in adult life, the recursive thinking, the inner critic, the imagined audiences, the horizon of completion that perpetually recedes. We have looked clearly at the daily texture of perfectionist life, with its particular exhaustions and its particular loneliness, and we have descended into the hidden patterns beneath the surface, the fear of exposure, the management of shame, the tyranny of the ideal, the terror of the unlived self. And then we have looked forward, toward the natural movement of return, toward the possibility of effort rooted in engagement rather than fear, toward the radical simplicity of a life in which rest does not require justification. What does this mean for your journey? Perhaps it means looking at the next moment of exhaustion, not with the familiar guilt, but with a different kind of attention. Perhaps it means asking, gently, without agenda, what the desire to stop is trying to say. Perhaps it simply means sitting with the awareness that you have spent a very long time trying very hard, and that the trying has been, in its way, an act of love, imperfect, inherited, genuinely yours. The quiet self, the one beneath the performance, has not gone anywhere. It has been there all along, waiting with the patience that only the truest parts of us possess. It does not need to be rebuilt. It needs only to be returned to, one moment of genuine rest at a time. Thank you for this shared journey. End of the audiobook.